What's up, chess fans? It's GM Max here, telling you about how player X won the 2021 US Championship. I got the idea from this video title from one of my other passions of Survivor, which seems quite apt because that's basically how our winner won this tournament. He didn't lose any games on the way to winning the title, but then when it came down to the playoff, he managed to get the necessary wins against his adversaries and basically win when it counted to take the title. So you might be wondering, well, who exactly won the US Championship? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep it in suspense, and at the end of the video I'm going to reveal who this mystery player X was who won the title. So the first game I'm going to show is a game between this player playing with a white piece against Darius Schwirsch in round 2 of the US Championship. This was player X's first win, and let's see how the game went. It was e4, c5, and player X decided to go for the Moscow variation of bishop b5, which is a way to avoid things like open Sicilians like knight off, which of course has its own very large body of theory. So bishop b5 is a way to avoid that and play more for kingside development. The game went bishop d7, take, pawn to c4, building a nice Maroczy bind structure with knight c3, d4. You'll notice that in a position like this, like we get in the game, that if black were to play c takes d4 and knight takes d4, well, you get the desired Maroczy bind structure and the space advantage, but where you aren't stuck with your bad bishop because you already exchanged it beforehand. Also, I forgot to mention at the start of this video, do make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it, and consider subscribing if you are new to the channel. Let's continue with how the game played out, because Schwirsch played it in a somewhat unusual way. He decided not to play the automatic pawn takes pawn, but instead he played queen to g4, hitting this pawn as well. How would you deal with this queen attack if you were playing it as white here, just out of interest? So white found a very good move in the game. He realized that if you play castles, black goes knight d4, trades off a bajillion pieces, and basically the principle when playing against the space that white has here is to trade off as many pieces as you can, because that relieves the cramp a bit. Whereas by playing d5, white shows that, okay, queen g2 is not a real threat, because rook g1, the queen still comes under fire, and you still have to deal with this knight on c6. So the point of Schwirsch's play is to play knight d4. We had knight takes, queen takes, and now white decided to play knight takes d1 with the idea that after c takes d4, that the knight is not under attack here, so you have time to play f3 and just build this very solid light squared pawn center, while the pawn on d4 you can try to attack with your pieces later, as a little bit separated from the other black pawns. For a theoretical perspective, probably king d1 and knight b5 probably gives a bigger advantage, where you threaten a knight c7 fork, which is why black doesn't have time to go pawn grabbing with knight e4. And if rook c8, the point is that even though you have both your pawns under attack, that you just sort of laugh in their face, play king e2, and say that white is better because you're sort of able to take this pawn anyway, and if they do play something like rook takes c4, they end up coming under a big problem of king d3, and you know, if these two pieces are forked, and if they do play knight f2, unfortunately the knight in the corner is a goner, bishop e3, and white will be up a piece when the dust finally settles. But okay, that's for the theory nerds. Let's see what happened in the actual game with knight d4, d1, cd4, f3, rook c8. Kind of feel like white wants to play b3 anyway and try to go after the pawn. So maybe you would go e5 first and perhaps go to more of a dark squared blockade perhaps. I think black should be doing fine there, but rook c8 was played, and then after b3 he went for the move pawn e5. Now in these close positions it's all about in terms of, well, what is the pawn break that both sides are going to be preparing here. And I think from white's perspective it makes sense that he wants to expand probably on the king side, because it's going to be kind of hard to push these pawns forward with a pressure on c4. In turn, black is probably going to try to chip away with a move like f5, maybe a move like b5 to open files for the rooks. So in that base, a move like a4 would be very natural, just putting a blot to b5, and you know, if they play a6, you can go a5 yourself and make it harder for him to get this in, fixing two of their pawns with one of our own. Of course, black wouldn't play a6, but there's just to demonstrate black struggles in getting in that b5 push. So I played g4 in this position, and it's also quite a reasonable approach where we just cover the f5 square like this. Game continued, bishop to e7, king to e2. I mean, again, black should probably be okay with correct play. Probably if you play knight d7 and just kind of build this sort of fortress, I think that it's kind of hard for white to really break through. But we had the move h5 instead, g5, knight d7, and our player x went bishop d2, castles, knight to f2. And okay, now white is just continuing to maneuver, and for the most part, this next phase is not that critical, but sort of a6 is probably where things start to go a little bit wrong for black. I think instead of playing a6 and going for b5 or f5, I think your best bet is just to sit and wait, like b6. And if knight d3 like in the game, I guess you can go f5 now. And it's probably a better version in comparison, going for gf6, rook f6. I think black is going to get enough counterplay against f3, and I mean, you can deal the pressure on the g file pretty easily. The knight can always come to c5. So in general, I mean, white's got a tiny edge, but I think that black should be able to hold it, because he doesn't have any major weaknesses. The only real weakness is g7, but that's pretty easily defended by black. One weakness is normally not enough to win the game for the most part, unless it's a really big weakness they can't defend. But then a6 was played, and the problem with a6 is that if you play a move like b5, which I assume was his idea, then, well, there are a lot of strategic problems. White can take... For one thing, there's a possibility of the knight coming into c6, but maybe an even bigger reason is that when you play b5, you're just helping white to achieve his goal of creating a passed pawn on the queen side. It's very easy to just keep pushing this guy, like b4 to take c5 from the knight. These pieces can sort of flood in on the a file, and we see that these pieces are a very long way from the action on the queen side, and for this reason, this is just not playable for black. In effect, white's a pawn up because his d4 pawn is just perfectly blockaded by that lovely knight on d3. So the game instead saw f5, trying to get some counterplay on the king side. G takes. Black side to take back with the pawn. And really, if you take with the rook, you're still running into like a4, a5, and still your pawns are going to be kind of stuck here. But okay, game went rook hg1, king h7. A nice move by player x here, just rook g3, just building up along the open file. White's pretty happy if the rooks get traded, because even if black does play rook g8, the point is that they're not really threatening to take g3. So play a4, take. Well, we see that here that the pawn on h5 is coming under attack, and white's pawns now all in one very healthy pawn island, whereas black's are split into 3 pawn islands, making them a lot more difficult to defend in the future. And that's why white is clearly better here. Instead, black thought he could play to move h4. Unfortunately, after rook g4, you've just made that pawn a bigger weakness, and although this is an endgame, it actually finished pretty fast from here. Black played f5, which is the only way really to defend that pawn. We had e takes f5. Black played rook takes f5, grabbing the pawn back. Rook a to g1, threatening a rook g7, fork the king and the bishop like that. We had rook to e8 to defend. And now a really nice maneuver by white. I'm not going to make it a puzzle, because frankly, any sort of move other than like putting a rook on pre would be winning for white. But still, the maneuver of knight f2, bring that knight to the e4 outpost and hitting that weakness on d6. It's a sort of maneuver that definitely takes you from a position that should be winning to just actually winning it in practice. To win one game doesn't always win itself, as they say. So knight f6 is played, rook g7, king h8, and very nice move by player x, rook f7, pinning the knight and essentially freezing the rook in place. Meanwhile, the other rook can come in the attack like so. Rook h5 was played, rook g6, knight g8, and knight e4. Just at this point, black is not able to defend all the weaknesses like d6, his king, just too many weak squares and weak pawns. So rook d8, bishop g5, trading the bad bishop, because it's actually the best defender in black's position. If bishop takes, you just take with the knight, and you can even put a knight in here, or go rook fg7 and go knight f7 mate. And black is just running out of moves to play here. So the game went rook h7, and white found a nice little mini combination, rook takes c7, with the point that knight e7, bishop f6, and suddenly black has to commit suicide with the rook or simply resign. So the game saw rook e7, bishop takes h4, and since white is about to take and just collect the harvest, because winter has long passed, black decided to resign here. So a pretty convincing win for player X, and one that did put him in the equal lead, if I am not mistaken. And of course, he had mostly draws. As I said, he was one of the very few undefeated players across the whole tournament. And so he had basically, well, after a draw and a win, he then had 4 more draws before this next game that he played in round 7 against one of the sensations of the tournament, John Burke, who some of you may know as being the youngest player of all time to get a FIDE rating of 2600 plus. Although there is a little bit of an asterisk stat, because this was a time when FIDE had a 40k factor for junior players below 2300, and because of that, the way that it worked, and it being like a 3-month rating period, it meant that he was able to gain 350 rating points in in this sort of rating period, even though his performance rating was only 2468. Obviously, not John Burke's fault that the system was not really, let's say, very effective at the time. But yeah, that's a story of how he got to 2600 plus. At the time of this game, he was rated 2554, more balanced, still a grandmaster as such. So game went e4, e5, so just a Berlin, and I know what you're thinking, like Berlin, let's fall asleep already, but no, White played the anti-Berlin. White realized that, okay, I'm not going to enter the Berlin endgame and have a snooze fest, let's keep the tension in the position. And of course, when White defends the pawn, they are threatening to take our pawn, but you can actually play bishop c5 anyway, because after takes, White really shouldn't take that pawn, because queen d4 is a pretty nasty fork, and okay, those who play the Spanish with either side know this already, but for those who don't, it explains why Black plays like this. So White goes c3 instead, castles, and okay, here bishop c6 is not as bad as before, because okay, at least now there's no queen d4. But Black can go d5, and sort of this theory from 20 years ago, where you end up sacking the pawns, but you get such a big attack with your leading development that if anyone's better, it's probably even Black if White is not careful here. I guess White can go d4 and kick the bishop back, but you're not really fighting for an advantage. So that's why all the big boys these days play castles, and now rather than a normal move like d6, so played rook to e8, which essentially is aimed against bishop to g5, where the point is that with this move order, because you haven't played d6 yet, you've got the option to play like a6, h6, and then at some good moment you can just even play a move like bishop to e7. I'm not 100% sure if this is the perfect moment for it, but it's still an idea that you can go d6, knight h5, and sort of trade off your bad bishop for their good bishop, while still bringing your knight towards f4. It's an idea that Aronian played quite a lot in the last 10 or so years, and since a lot more strong players have followed in his footsteps, but I think this is sort of Aronian's kind of brainchild, as it were, in terms of like bringing this to popularity and common knowledge. But this is why, although bishop g5 is of course a perfectly reasonable move and actually the first choice of the computer, White instead played knight bd2, just very normal Spanish moves, a6. After bishop a4, I mean, if Black goes d6, you're just back into a kind of normal a6 Spanish position. But so showed the advantage of delaying d6, that the idea is not just to deal with bishop g5, but also you've got d5, and now you've managed to get the nice space advantage in the center. Now this game is also one that is relatively short, so I think this is a good moment to maybe point out that Burke's move at d4 might not be a very good one in this position, and perhaps was the source of his subsequent problems. Instead, I think a normal move would just be to keep the tension in the center. A move like h3 is very normal, just making sure you can play your rook e1 and play your typical Lopez maneuver, the knight to g3, without running into some knight g4. Although, to be fair, after rook e1, I'm not sure if knight g4 is all that great, but I guess it is a candidate move in the position. Though probably more normal continuation would just be like take h6 and, just say this position is just balanced, normal development, and the game goes on. So the game instead saw d4, but d4 is just asking a bit too much of the position. And after e takes d4, c takes d4. Actually, here's so missed quite a nice opportunity. I want to see if you can find the move that was played in the game. So what would you do here with Black to play? So in the game, Black played the move bishop to a7, which of course is still playable. Hopefully you didn't fall for bishop takes d4, bishop c6, and simply losing a piece. That is not the way in which you win the US Championship title, I'm afraid. But the move that Black could have played is actually to move pawn to b5, which on the surface looks very unnatural. because after dc5 it looks like, well, white just goes queen takes a4 and wins a pawn, right? But actually after queen a4 you now have this move d takes e4. And if they play queen takes e6, the point is that you play bishop to d7, queen b7, e takes f3, knight takes, and now you've got this key move of rook b8. And surprisingly, there's just no way for white to avoid the loss of material, because if you take the pawn, there's this lovely bishop b5 fork, hitting the rook and hitting the queen at the same time, which is just really bad for white, because at the end, if they take, you're going to have a queen d1 and checkmate. But if they go queen a7 instead, you can just snap that trap shut, bishop c6, and either you play rook 8 and you win the queen next move, or they take and you got exactly the same idea we saw a move ago. So b5 would be very strong. Of course, white probably shouldn't take a4, but instead bail out with ed5, but it's still bad for white. But instead we had bishop a7, which allows white to go e5 and at least sort of make sense of the position. Because even though black has bishop pair and some ideas to undermine the white center, white does at least have the better structure and a bit of space to work with. Though here you probably should play knight b3 and just try to pressure that pawn on c6 and not make it so easy for black to get in a scot-free c5. But after queen c2 in the game, then we had a lovely move, bishop to f5. And it's sort of a theme that we see with this game, where black is not afraid to sacrifice a pawn for a big initiative. And if you don't play queen c6, it's not really obvious why you play queen c2. So white did take the poison pawn in the game. But after rook e6, queen a4, there's so many good moves for black. I mean, here I feel like the position is crying out for the rook lift, rook g6. Because then you can go bishop h3 and you're just piling the attack, and white's pieces are out of commission. These guys are taking sick leave and now they're needed and no one can find them. But in the game, c5 was played. Not the top move, but it's still a very strong one. I mean, certainly opening up the center with the bishop pair is very principled. In the game, white played d takes c5. If they go knight takes e4, you just take with the pawn. And that way, that tempo on the knight really proves useful. Because after knight g5, rook g6. Well, it turns out the knight's actually trapped here. That you're just threatening to win 2 minor pieces for a rook. And then the bishop is just crisscross applesaucing the white rooks, just completely killing. So white instead put his hopes in d takes c5, knight takes c5, queen f4. And bishop d3 is a nice move. You can see how black is just continually attacking the white pieces so you don't get the time to consolidate. White played the move b4, kind of realizing that, if you put the rook on d1, black can play bishop e2 and just go for some juicy knight to d3 forks from there. And if rook e1, even though it's a bit slower, still like bishop c2, knight d3 still bring the sniper on a7 to life, hitting the rook, bishop, queen, and pawn is just really not playable for white. So white plays b4, offering an exchange sacrifice, which is immediately a sign of desperation, but it's not like white has much better. Now white probably would have taken the rook, but instead black went knight e4, wanting to keep up the pressure rather than just grab material. So take, knight g5. Of course, not just the rook is under attack, but also the pawn on f7. So rook e7 defends them both. Bishop b2 was played. And yeah, bishop e2 is admittedly a mistake. White had to find the move rook d1 and probably didn't play this because he realized that bishop d4 is winning the exchange. But white can go queen f5 and try to get some counterplay against the king. So you end up kind of sacking the exchange. It's not completely lost for white at least. But in a game after bishop b2, black found a really nice move and one actually not so easy to spot, but if you want to, you can pause the video to see if you can play like our champion player X. So what black did is he played the move pawn to e3. Now you might be wondering, well, why would you play pawn to e3? And the reason is that you're basically just weakening their structure quite a lot. And that means you can then play either the move f6, which the engine points out, the idea being that they can't take ef6 because you go bishop takes e3 and suddenly, boom, king and queen are forked. But instead we had bishop f1, which, okay, still an okay move. And queen d3 is a very precise response from player X, hitting the pawn on e3 and more or less forcing bishop d4. But after takes, we can see that even though, materially speaking, white has a knight and 2 pawns for the exchange, which is actually slightly more valuable than a rook on average. But here the key factor is that the rook is just a lot more active in such an open position, and black also has the initiative. White forced to play this retreat knight f3 to defend. Black played to move queen c3 to go after this pawn, which actually is probably a mistake. In fact, probably you should instead play rook b7, and I think that's a better way to go after the pawn, because then sometimes you can eventually go rook b1 after taking the pawn and sort of try to trade off the rook. It's kind of a principle if you have two rooks and they have one. It's a good idea to trade off their remaining rook, because sometimes the second rook ends up a little bit superfluous if they're on the same file, for example. Just a little advanced principle that can be helpful for making these decisions. So after queen c3, White actually had a chance to kind of get back in the game, and White sort of had the right idea in theory of going after the king and trying to create counterplay, but he didn't go about it the right way. It turns out that actually knight h4 is possible at this point, and it also kind of explains why it was better to play rook b7, because now the point is if you take on d4, then White's going to take and play to move knight to f5. Big knight fork, and suddenly it's White who is much better as a result. But if you can't play to take on d4, then knight f5 is suddenly creating some very nasty threats to the king. And if you play g6, White has a very deep idea. They can play just knight to f3 back again, allowing stuff like queen h6, knight g5, the pawn can come in. And it turns out Black's dark square is so weak that White actually has enough compensation for the exchange based on just his sheer attack on the black king. So quite a deep variation. Of course, it's not at all easy to see the idea of basically spending 2 tempi just to provoke a weakening g6 move, but g6 is so weakening that it's actually worth giving up 2 moves to make them play g6 in a sense. But after h4, unfortunately, this idea of moving the rook's pawn up just doesn't really do anything, because after queen b4 h5, Black simply blocked it with h6, which also stops the knight coming in this way. And now it's kind of a bit late to go knight h4, because if you play knight h4, just rook d4, and White's just not in time to muster anything at this point. So game ended g4, and this is of course kind of desperation. Rook b7, queen e4, rook b6. There's a really nice maneuver at the rook, because it means if they play something like g5, you can sort of take, and if needed, your rook can swing to the defense, or the pawn can come to the defense. Of course, White can't play knight g5, because queen d4 comes with a check, which means White doesn't have time to give mate with queen h7 and etc, etc. Well, the game concluded instead with, if I go back a couple of moves, to queen c2, rook db8, just preparing to invade down the file, rook d1, queen a3, and you can see that White's king is too exposed, and Black finished off with rook b2. And once the queens are traded, I mean, you're already threatening rook b1 mate, and the rooks are just way too strong, and Black is up material to boot, and so Burke resigned at this point. Now, these were the 2 wins that player X had in the 2021 US Championship, and, well, I was going to save the reveal for the end, but since I already accidentally said his name twice, or more than twice if you count the times I did a pun of, like, saying, the word that also is his name. So the answer is that it was Wesley So that won the 2021 US Championship with a score of 6.5 out of 11. But how did he win in the playoffs? Who were the players that tied with him? Well, tied for first with him on 6.5 out of 11 were Fabiano Caruana and the young US talent Sam Sevian. But actually their paths to this 6.5 out of 11 were very different, where So, of course, had very solid +2, not losing any games, but also only winning 2 games. It's sort of an interesting point that all of the 2700 plus GMs actually lost points in this tournament, because a lot of the players below 2700 actually were performing very well and were playing much better than their ratings. And, well, Sevian was an example of that, because Sevian, well, I think he lost 1 game but won 3, if I remember correctly. I haven't checked it exactly, but it's sort of interesting. In round 10, he actually had a threefold repetition against Wesley So in a position where Sevian was effectively up a pawn for nothing, more or less, that Black didn't have any compensation. But it ended up being a repetition, and you can just imagine, like, if Sevian had played on that pawn up position and then gone on to beat So, well, then we would be doing how Sevian won the 2021 US Championship. As for Caruana actually had a bit of a rough start to the tournament. At one point around the middle of the event, he actually lost 2 games in a row. I think it was to Naroditsky and Sevian, if I remember correctly. But then he had a big comeback where in rounds 9 and 10, he won 2 games in a row. And was actually winning against Sam Shanklin in the last round as well, but ended up not converting his decisive advantage to a win, where Shanklin found some good resources, and the game ended in a draw, which led to this playoff. And because Sevian had the best tiebreak, because on the head-to-head encounters, So and Caruana drew of each other, and So and Sevian drew, but Sevian had beaten Caruana, that meant that Sevian had the best sort of tie-break in theory, meaning that So and Caruana was like 2 and 3, played each other in the first game, and this was really the game that set up the whole tournament, as it were, or the whole playoff. Those who are wondering, the time control of this three-way playoff was 10 plus 2, so that's 10 minutes plus 2 second increment per move, and if there was still a tie, then there would be an Armageddon game or set of Armageddon games to determine the winner of the title. But as we'll see, it didn't come to Armageddon because Wesley So was just too strong in this playoff phase. Now against Caruana, he had the black pieces, and Caruana decided to play an English opening, maybe figuring that the Berlin might just be a bit too solid to prove anything against. So English opening. We had knight f6, knight c3, and e5. And his kind of move order, delayed e5, is just kind of to try to avoid some options like e5 and g3, for example, is one approach where white can try to have some extra options from delaying knight c3. For example, bishop e4 pins aren't really possible if you haven't put the knight on c3 already as white. And if they play g3 instead, then you kind of get some extra options like c6, d5, kind of putting the blot on their bishop with a Slav setup. It's kind of some extra options you get with the one knight f6 move order. Now, after knight c3, black plays e5, not wanting to let white perhaps transpose back into a d4 opening later. So knight f3, knight c6, and yeah, another move, e4, is the move that's kind of the most popular in Indian games, and this Nims iteration is also the move that Caruana played in this game. And this is a line, actually, that I remember playing quite a bit about 10 or so years ago, because I really like this sort of fork trick trap where you meet bishop c5 with knight takes e5, and the point of this, in case you're wondering, is that after knight e5, d4, white does get the piece back. The lines are kind of sharp. It turns out that there's some very deep Indian analysis where it's kind of been worked out that after like queen f3, take, that black can play this very inhuman move of bishop a5, which looks completely crazy, but the idea is you're keeping the pressure on his pawn so that they can't go and just win your pawn on g7 and just pile a big attack. There's a lot of sharp theory. The point is that you kind of end up sacking the pawn with d6 and using their open king in the center to equalize. But the way that So played is a much more solid approach, just playing bishop b4, meaning d3 with d6, and then after the move a3, it's not really the best idea to play bishop takes c3. I mean, it's not losing by any means, but you are kind of justifying white's play, because the double pawns actually help white in covering his one hole on d4 that he had before the exchange. And also, white does have the bishop pair advantage, and I think I've even had a game from a very similar position to this one. I think I maybe had it with the pawn on e3 instead of the pawn on e4. I hadn't played the move a3, but I had this once in a game a few years ago, and it was very easy and comfortable for white to play. But anyway, the bishop c5 move that So played is the most critical, and in the old days, or old days not the right word, but in the last couple of years, normally GMs like to play this move of knight a4 in the past. This was the main move in over-the-board play, trying to go after the bishop pair. But then bishop d4, and if white takes, the knight kind of takes the place of the bishop, taking that outpost. And so people realize that this is basically fine for black, and so the main move in Indian games, although it's not so common in over-the-board play yet, is actually the move bishop e3 that Caruana played. So we had castles, bishop e2, and bishop e3 is quite a committal decision because, well, you might think, well, the reason I rejected that bishop c3 was not played by So is because it helps cover the d4 square, and now we see this pawn e3 is covering d4, and white gets a nice half-open f-file. And all that is true, but for all the space that white has, it's not easy for white to really find a great pawn break. And so, of course, bishop e3 is not the only move. There's also moves like, for example, bishop g4, with the idea of taking on f3 and dumping a knight on d4 without it getting traded off by their pieces. So that's definitely the dark squared strategy. There's also moves like knight g4 to kind of make them take you, and say that it's kind of worth giving up a couple of tempi with the knight to open this file for the rook and have an f5 break. It's another approach to the position, and all of them, to be fair, are quite playable. Bishop e3 perhaps being the most solid approach, just going knight e7, maneuvering the knight to g6, and just saying that your knight's doing a very good job of protecting your king. Actually, I said that black has very much reminds me of 4-player chess, with the very similar idea of maneuvering the knights, so they're both covering the king and just guarding against any attacks down the files. Anyway, white played a move queen to d2. Of course, there are a lot of other moves. White can also try expand on the queen side, for example. But queen e2 is a flexible move that keeps the options open. Now, normally when you play knight e7, g6, a nice point is that you can go c6 and often think about playing moves like d5 later. It is true it does undouble the pawn, so maybe you wouldn't go for d5 so quickly. But it does take some squares from the knight, and you can try to sort of make a little kind of unloosening moves like a5 to try to weaken white just a little bit, or at least to keep white guessing as to when we're going to open the queen side with a takes b4. But instead, so I played rook e8. And rook e8 I think is maybe a little bit imprecise, because probably the idea of rook e8 is that you want to avoid d4 and have some pressure against the pawn. The reality is that d4 would just weaken e4 anyway, so it's not really a move that white's normally going to play. Well, Caruana continued with the move rook a to e1. We had the move pawn a5, which kind of makes sense when the rook is no longer on this file. So I tried to keep the queenside closed with b5, c6. I mean, for the next part of the game was more or less just a maneuvering phase, not really a great deal happening. H6 again, a very thematic move. In these positions, just sort of taking squares away from the pieces, and, well, if the position opens up salt later, it might be useful to have that luft for the king as well. And now white plays the move d4, which, objectively speaking, is probably not a very good move in this position, for the reason I said that you are weakening this e4 pawn quite a lot. But at the same time, it kind of shows Caruana's fighting spirit. Because, I mean, if you play some move like bishop a4 as the suggestion of the computer, but after bishop d7, it's not quite clear what white's plan is. I mean, I guess you can go h3, but the thing is, if you go g4, you're kind of weakening the king, and black's knights are really well placed to kind of blockade on the dark squares if white tries to go for a pawn storm. So it's one of these positions where, yeah, Injun says white is slightly better, but very hard to really put a dent in black's position, because black has no real weaknesses at the moment. In the game, we had pawn to d4. Black played the move queen to e7, just wanting to keep the tension. I kind of like the idea of playing c takes b5 personally, because normally this would just be a mistake because knight b5 and you just create all these weaknesses in your structure, but now because d4 is played, you've got knight takes e4 in reply. So white would kind of be prompted to take with the pawn, and bishop e6, and suddenly white's got a few holes in the position, and I do think that black has got a pretty nice advantage here. I mean, a move like d5 is something it's absolutely thrilled to see, because after d5 you can just trade the knight if you want. Your knight has a beautiful outpost on c5, and black is just better in every strategic sense here. Well, black instead went queen e7, and now after bishop c2, it's a bit too late to go cb5, because now the pawn is defended, so black instead plays bishop d7. White played a move d5 again, not really liking this move that much, because it does give a beautiful c5 outpost to that black knight. It's kind of like, black is sort of just dreaming like, oh, I dream that my dear noble steed can have a beautiful outpost. Oh, I thought that my liege would give it to me, not my opponent's king being so generous. But anyway, probably, yeah, white should just take on c6, maybe try and get the knight in. But black is still pretty solid. But d5 does feel like a kind of frustrated sort of move. So c takes b5, cb5. Rook ec8 was played. I guess he put the e-rook because he wanted to make sure that this pawn is defended in case white tries to go after it. We had bishop d3, and yeah, now I think in this position, you've kind of seen this plan already, so I don't need to make it a puzzle, but once again, I think bishop g4 is a good idea, where the bishop is not really doing that much. It's kind of dominated by their pawns anyway, so why not just trade it and, put the knight on c5. In fact, even the other knight can potentially come to c5 as well. You can even choose which knight will go for it. Just, don't tell both knights about it. They're going to kind of fight over it, like some sort of Twilight love triangle where both the guys want to get the girl. In any case, game saw a4. a4, I mean, he's trying to split these pawns and fix the weakness, but I think the a4 pawn itself can also be a bit of a weakness here that could come under fire. So not a huge fan of a4 personally. We had queen b2. Queen d8 is a really nice maneuver to bring the queen around and attack some of these weaknesses. It also means after queen b4 that black, can try to do some things like he played queen a5 in the game. Actually, queen a5 I'm not so keen on, because I think in the rising endgame the rook is going to be rather misplaced on a5, and, well, it'll take a lot of time to actually bring it back to do something useful. I mean, obviously he was worried about knight takes a4. This is what So wanted to avoid. But I think that queen b6 actually works, because if white does play knight a4, the point is that, well, for one thing, you can even just play queen a7 and just get the pawn back, and, I mean, that's the easiest way, and then your rooks come in and, just invasion city here. But we had to move queen a5 in the game. Take, and of course, this is a 10+2 game, so, of course, even the best players in the world are going to make some sort of mistakes this time control. It's just part of the journey. But so far, no tactical mistakes. Most of them have just been more of a sort of subtle strategic nature. Rook A8 was played, as something that strong players do a lot is they try to improve the worst placed piece. The rook on A5 was a one piece that wasn't really doing anything in reality because everything was covered anyhow. So black seeks to bring it back to the C file. Now a move like knight D2 would be interesting, trying to hit D6 and hit the move B6. It looks pretty good, but in the game we had knight A2 instead, which sort of gave black a bit more time to try to do something and sort of disrupt white's usual sort of setup, like of trying to get the knight here. This one you might want to pause the video to see if you can find this move, because it definitely is important for ensuring that white doesn't get too much pressure. So good luck see if you can find it. So this is what I call a toilet puzzle, and what a toilet puzzle means is something that if you are a chess coach or if you've had lessons from a chess coach before, then you'll definitely understand this reference very well, where you kind of are doing a lesson and you need to go to the toilet. So what you do is just quickly set a puzzle, like you say in a position, okay, what would you do if they play this move, or what move would you play in this position? And then instead of saying, I need to go to the toilet, the coach says, I'll be right back in a minute. And then they rush to the toilet, and then they come back and, you've been thinking about the position in the meantime. So that's why I call it a toilet puzzle. I have to admit, this idea of the toilet puzzle is not completely my own idea, because many, many years ago, Nigel Short, World Championship finalist, actually came up with the idea of the toilet move, which is where you need to go to the toilet. It's like you're absolutely busting, you can't wait any longer. So you just bash out some quick move of the board and just run to the toilet before the opponent can make their move in reply. So anyway, going back to the position though, there's actually several reasonable moves in this position. I mean, you can improve the position of your king, you can improve the position of your knight. All reasonable approaches, but the move knight g4 that's so played is a bit more precise, because if you wait a move to play knight g4, white will be in time to go knight c4 and defend the pawn and also hit the weaknesses, whereas here it's not in time. And also a point is as well that black now has the option to play moves like rook c1 and can try to deflect that rook away from the defense of e3. And probably black should actually have played rook takes c1 in the game. Certainly knowing how to assess this tension is a big part of what makes a very strong chess player, because at first glance you might have learned, okay, you don't play rook takes c1 because they take and you just lost the open file and improved their rook. But it's actually not that simple, because it turns out you can play rook a5 and by counterattacking this pawn, hoping that they sort of block the file and then you take the pawn so that it can't go like rook c7. It's a bit more complicated than this, but basically the diagnosis is that black is doing fine here, which unfortunately can't really be said for what happened in the game. After king f8, I mean, king f8 is safe, but it also doesn't really get to the heart of the position. White still has time to go knight d2 and do the standard maneuver, which both players somehow forgot about. I think they play like a big sort of crowd, and probably actually I'm not sure how it works at the St. Louis Chess Club, because I actually visited there, but probably a lot of people are watching, at least online. Because I know when I was playing tournaments, there'd be this big beehive of all these people gathering around the board, and it sounds like there'd be people up there would be literally right next to you, almost like a kid walked in on my video and started talking. Okay, not really talking, but this is something that one has to deal with when you get into top level chess, dealing with the crowd as well as the opponent. Anyway, the game saw knight to b4 instead. We had king to e8. Actually, this is kind of a critical position. Probably a better approach is just to swap once again and, say after rook c8 that even after rooks get traded, they still have this weak pawn, and somehow white's weaknesses are bigger than black's weaknesses. It all comes down to who can attack them first, really, and in this case, black is the victor. But instead we had king e8, which gives white the time to go h3 and kick that knight out of there, saying, shoo away, pesky beast. We had knight to d2. Black played king to e7 here. King e7 is kind of a natural move, because you are anticipating knight to c4, at least in terms of defending the pawn in advance. But you're still dealing with knight b6, so it's still not that great, in all fairness. So black played rook c5, and I mean, it's already kind of a difficult position, because probably instead of king e7, what black had to do was play something like rook c1 and maybe try to defend with something like knight e7. And it looks ugly, but the idea is to meet knight c4, knight c8, and kind of cover your weaknesses that way. Not the most pleasant way to do it, but in this case, function is more important than aesthetics. It's kind of like a example where, let's say, like, you're looking for a relationship, like, yeah, your image, like, ideal partner is going to be, like, someone, like, insanely, like, good looking, but, of course, not, like, the only factor in this decision. It's like that with chess. Sounds like it's just best to play the ugly move because it just is better than all the other options. So anyway, the game sort of moved king to e7. We had knight c4, rook to c5, trying to just block everything on the c file, but then knight b6, and unfortunately the blocking is not happening here. And after rook a5, I mean, the entrance says it's not the best move, but it's kind of like if you don't play it, you just have this rook just completely stuck doing nothing. I mean, if you play rook a7, like, the rook is just completely stuck in this position. Knight is completely dominating it. So, like, for all practical purposes, you kind of have to go rook a5 to have any chance of realistically saving it. Rook takes c5, and now this is actually a very nice point, because if it wasn't for white's next move, black would simply take this pawn and be quite a lot better. But Caruana has played this endgame very well, and here he played the move knight to c6. I know I spent a lot of time on the game already, but I can assure the next one will be a lot shorter. So the point is that after takes, the idea of the knight sack is that now white's got these connected passed pawns, and you don't really have a good way to deal with them, because let's say you try to keep your bishop alive with bishop e8, which is not what happened in the game, by the way. I mean, white can even play the move d6 here. And if you take the pawn and knight to c4, monster fork, Godzilla's in the house, and white is just up too much material, and it's just going to infiltrate, and that's GG, folks. So, and of course you can always play c7 and just get the piece back this way as well. There's more than one way you can kind of win it, but d6s ain't the best way. But instead we had bishop takes c6. Now this is a very good defense. At least after king d8, you're not letting that pawn queen, and you split up the connected passed pawns by giving back the piece. And this is actually a point where if white plays this correctly, he's winning, but white didn't play it correctly, and in a matter of moves basically went from being winning to being losing, which can happen when you're low on time and also are playing for the US Championship title. It is true, of course, this is not the first title of either of these players. In fact, so is the defending champion for 2020 as such, and we know that he defended his title successfully, but not without a few scares, because in this position, white could play the move rook to b1. And the idea of rook b1 is simply to go knight d5 and rook b8 checkmate. Sounds easy enough, right? But if black goes knight e7 trying to stop that, white can just play knight to c4, just forking the rook, and now the pawn is also undefended. So now white is simply a pawn up, on track to perhaps grab a first another one here or another one here. Black's got too many weaknesses. White's up a pawn, white has the better pieces. It all just accumulates to white just being winning at this point. So had Caruana played this, it would have been he that would have been the champion, because after this game, Caruana did beat Sam Sevian in the next game. So with the benefit of hindsight, we could say that it would have been enough for him to win this game to win the title. But it wasn't to be. White played knight to d5, which, by the way, is not a terrible move either, but it does allow black now to play knight e7. And these pawns look incredibly strong, and they are, in fact, incredibly strong if white finds exactly the right move here. But if he doesn't, black's just going to put the knight on d6 and just completely blockade these pawns on the dark squares, making him not so effective after all. So what white had to do is it was very important to play the move rook to f1 first, provoking this move f6. I mean, if they take, you just take, and black's just got way too many weak pawns once the rook gets to the 7th rank. So black kind of has to go f6 to deal with that, but then e4. And the difference here compared to the game is that now, if black plays a move knight c8, and this is the position that happened in the game, but the difference was these moves weren't inserted. Well, it turns out inserting f6 is a really big achievement for white, because now he has rook to b1, and when you play rook b7, you're now hitting this guy on g7, which you wouldn't be in the other line. And if you try to stop that with knight to d6, then there's rook to b8. And after king c7, boom, rook to g8. And this is the key point. If the pawn's on f7, black goes g6 and laughs at the rook and say, haha, your rook's doing nothing, go, fight somewhere else. But now it just is completely killing, c4, rook takes g7, and white's just up a pawn. And it's a pretty strong extra pawn. You can keep collecting the harvest here, and at the end of the day, once white just brings the other pieces like the king in, it's going to be a win for white. Like up a pawn, black's pawns are too weak, this c6 pawn is too strong. But instead, white played e4, And that is the move that basically you could say cost Caruana the US Championship, because now knight c8 and black is in time to bring the knight here. And so we had rook b1, knight d6, and like I said before, rook b8 is not really leading anywhere now because black is just defending everything with this beautiful knight on d6. Instead, we had king to f2, which admittedly this is kind of a mistake. Apparently you had to go g4 and try to stop these pawns running here, because that's black's main plan to play for a win at this point. But instead goes king f2, c4, and yeah, very nice move by Wesley So here. If you find this move, you're very much on track to win as black, or at least you get a big advantage. So what's the move to play? Kind of fun I was able to set a lot of puzzles for this game. This was definitely of the 4 games, the one with like the most sort of interest like competitively, but also the most kind of content in terms of interesting moments and instructive lessons from the game. So whether you're here to be entertained or whether you're here so that you can one day, give Magnus Carlsen a run for his money, well, we've got you covered. So white would be better here, except the move f5 is really strong. Just hitting at the base of the pawn chain, because obviously you don't want to hit at the front of the pawn chain because it just doesn't do anything. But by hitting at the base, well, now you're able to get that soft underbelly on e4. If e takes f5, you can even play rook takes d5 and go after this guy. And actually, a computer is saying it's better to play king to c7 here, like sort of some genius point that you say the pawn is kind of getting in the way of the rook and you give up a million pawns and somehow are better. I don't know, it's too advanced for me. Computers, they have a way of ruining everything. Trying to tell a good story here, and Indian says, "Oh, but this is winning. This is you could do that instead." It's like, come on, let us enjoy it without the director's cut or director's commentary. Anyway, game went king e3, and black could have played fe4 immediately, but he played king to c7 first, and after rook to b4, now he played fe4. Good move. Bishop takes e4. Black now played a move pawn to c3, and okay, players were obviously low on time, so black did not find the very beautiful point that you can actually play rook takes c5 and sacrifice the pawn on a4, because pawn to c3, and suddenly they can't stop this pawn on the c file unless they give up the bishop or play bishop c2 and give up the pawn, and you do this stuff, and basically white can try to take on g7, but at the end of the day, black is just way too active, where you're going to play like knight c4, kick the queen away, push your pawn on c2, and once you basically win that bishop for the pawn, as long as you keep one pawn alive as black, like your passed e-pawn, for example, then you're going to win, basically. Well, instead of that, we had pawn to c3, and now after this, well, you have to find king d3, and you have to run back with the king to block the pawn, and then apparently white can barely survive after that. But after bishop c2 instead, black took the pawn, and now Caruana played the move rook takes a4, but unfortunately for him, he lost on time before he could complete the move and press the clock. But the reality is that even if he hadn't lost on time, it's still a completely lost position. For example, I just enter a variation. Simplest is just rook d2, hitting this guy, hitting the g2 pawn. Pawn on c6 is on once again. And I mean, white is just completely dominated by the black pieces. It's something like bishop to b3, rook takes g2. I mean, if you try something like rook a7, black just takes and there's 2 pawns up. If bishop d5, just goes c2 and the pawn is just queening now. So pretty straightforward in reality for black to win. Okay, I spent a lot of time on this game, but I think a lot of very valuable conclusions can be drawn. We saw how white in some cases tried a little bit too hard to force the play, and black could have maneuvered his knight like to c5, for example, is one idea that was not manifested in the game that would have given black a really nice advantage. As it was, Caruana managed to actually outplay So in the endgame, but missed some very important chances. Actually, this position here was kind of really the key moment, like a very good example of a comparison exercise, where we see that the difference of having f6 thrown in versus not thrown in is a really instructive point. And definitely like it's sort of a point when you do have two very similar positions or two very similar variations. A good question to ask is, well, what is the difference between them if we kind of play out the moves kind of normally? I will say it's probably one of the hardest techniques to actually get good at in terms of visualization. Probably my own weaknesses skill is one of the main things that held me back from reaching a higher FIDE rating myself. But anyway, at least it's good to know the technique exists and how to at least try to apply it yourself to think what is the difference and who does the difference favor. Anyway, moving on to the next game. Our final one here was the final game of the playoff, and this is where Wesley So had the white piece against Sam Sevian. Now, because Caruana had beaten Sevian in the game beforehand, this meant that basically So only needed to draw with the white pieces in order to win the US Championship title. Of course, a very nice situation for him, because with the white pieces you can play quite safely and at a very high level make it not so easy for black to get big winning chances, at least not without taking a lot of risks. Whereas if Sevian could win this game, then it would be all three players on 1 out of 2. The love triangle be complete. A beats B, who beats C, who beats A. But it wasn't to be, because So just played a very good game of chess here. He went d4, and Sevian, maybe being inspired by Carissa Yip's success winning the 2021 US Women's Championship, decided to also play this kind of modern approach. Unfortunately, while it worked very well for Carissa Yip, it didn't work as well for Sevian in this game. I mean, So's approach is very solid. I mean, if let's say you play a King's Indian style, it's very easy to play like something like a fianchetto, which is very safe, or even something like, let's say, exchange variation, where, if it's true that at a lower level there definitely is enough imbalance to play for a win, but at this level, it's very easy for white to play very safe and make it very hard for black to get big winning chances, and So, of course, would know how to play this. But Sevian decided to play knight d7. He's by putting a knight here, he's trying to keep more tension in the position, not allow any sort of exchange variations where all the pieces get hoovered off quickly. Now, after bishop e2, I mean, the normal move is to play knight f6 and just transpose back into a King's Indian, though it is a more passive version with a knight on d7, so you don't have knight c6 options, for example. But Sevian played knight e7, which I think for the tournament saying, if he was playing someone maybe 100 points lower rated, then yeah, it's a nice way to keep the tension and create some chances. Unfortunately, Wesley So is just a bit too good to leave this sort of moves unpunished. So he plays a move rook to e1. I mean, bishop e3 is maybe a little more active. The idea of bishop e3 that, if you can go d5, knight d2, and f3 is sort of the step you're typically aiming for. Although here they can meet d5 with f5, and that does sort of allow black to get some play. Of course, white probably isn't going to play d5, but probably going to play d5 instead. But that would be a whole other type of middle game. Because in the game we had rook e1, black played h6, which is a move you see trying to cover this square. And okay, d5 is apparently a very good transformation of the position, kind of saying that you can go bishop e3, c5, and this sort of a typical maneuver just to win on the queen side. But white goes bishop f1, which ends up being actually a very good decision in the game, because Sevian, in trying to unbalance the position a lot, actually kind of went out of the frying pan and into the fire, as it were. So the way in which I think black should play this position is just to play the move c5. Now, probably Sevian didn't want to play this because he thought, well, if white plays something like d takes e5, then you have this symmetrical structure where not a lot is really happening. But I mean, black can put the knight on a d4 to make up for the knight coming to d5, and there's a certain kind of strategic imbalance where I think that you could still try to outplay an opponent here. Though, of course, against So, it's never going to be easy to beat him with the black pieces, but at least you can try. But unfortunately, after f5, the problem with f5 is, I mean, it's not like a forced loss, but it generally is a lot less effective to play f5 in the King's Indian if white hasn't played d5 yet. And the reason is that after So's d takes e5, the black king just kind of gets opened up, and the opening ascent just favors white when you've got the lead in development and black's queenside piece is still stuck at home. Apparently the best approach is to play knight e5 and just play it down into an endgame. Obviously you can't take with the bishop because then you would lose the pawn on h6. But in the worst case, white can play like queen d8, and it's not the very best way to play it, but this is not realistically a position where black can get real winning chances, just very safe. So I can sort of understand why Sevian played d5 instead, but objectively it's a mistake, because after b4, white's play is just a lot faster on the queen side. c5, bishop c4, and his pawn storm is just nowhere near as effective when the center is still open. I mean, if f4, you can even play a move like h3 and meet g5 with knight h2, and black just never really getting in g4 in a decent version there in that case. So black goes knight c6, he meets b5 with knight d4, trying to at least use the outpost. Well, one good knight is one thing, but if all your other pieces are complete rubbish, it just isn't going to matter. And after bishop a3, while white gains tempo on the rook. In a way, this kind of position reminds me a little bit of a Leningrad Dutch with this like e5 and f5 thrown in and white just having so many extra tempi. Computer is saying ef5 is really strong, that you basically can rip apart their structure, like with gf5, take, this is meant to be really strong apparently. Or if they play knight f3 first, you kind of say that your queen develops and white just has a massive lead in development, and probably knight d5 and just jump something in, and something is going to work when you have all the pieces having such massive energy. So his move with c5, however, also keeps a pretty nice advantage. Probably best bet is knight f8 and at least try to support the knight or get your bishop out. I mean, knight f8 is a kind of thematic maneuver when you've got that hole on d4 to work with. Black went f takes e4 in the game, which unfortunately just fails tactically. After the move knight takes d4, that's just so that there's no knight f3 doubling the kingside pawns if knight e4, ed4, and now, I mean, a move like knight e4 definitely keeps a big advantage. There's nothing really wrong with this obvious move. But so he comes up with a big brain idea, bishop to c4. And the point of bishop c4 is that black can't take that knight because you take. And if king takes bishop, then there's queen to d5. And if king e8, well, it's getting mated down this e file. If king f8, there's c6 with a discovered check. And if king f6, I mean, what's the king doing on f6 in this position? This looks like a guess elo game. Rook e4, go rook e6, and black has got all these pieces not in the game. White has all these pieces in the game. 3 beats 0, so white wins. So black goes knight e5 because you don't really have anything better, but unfortunately now white is just up in exchange for nothing. And of course Sevian played on because, I mean, he was in a must-win game and was hoping that So might choke under the pressure of only needing like the draw to win the title. But So, he's very cool, calm and collected, and he won it pretty convincingly. Bishop e6, bishop c2, b2, just pressuring the weakness. Bishop c4, a4, keeping the pawns defended, a6. Knight d2 is a really nice move by white, where, you're giving back the pawn on b5. This is what happened in the game. Takes, swapsies, everything. But now the point is that black's kind of lost the initiative as well in kind of rerouting the bishop back this way. And after knight f3, black just is not able to defend this pawn. Well, okay, to be fair, you can play d3, but then you pay the price that, black's king now becomes very exposed. And after queen a1 check, just bring the queen in the attack with tempo. King to g8 was played, and now after knight d4, white is playing with really great energy. Not just hitting the bishop, but also threatening knight e6, forking queen and forking queen g7 checkmate. The game ended as follows. Bishop c4, queen c3, b5, en passant. No, it's not an illegal move. You can actually do that. Knight to d6, knight c6. You can see that knight's just coming in and all the tactics just work for white. Queen to g5. Pawn to b7. Nice little shot that black can't take the pawn because the knights need to defend the bishop, and that's game over. So black played bishop d5. b8 queens with check. So sorry black, but you don't have queen to g2 checkmate here. King f7, queen c7, and mate in X moves. And therefore Sevian resigned, and Wesley So thus became the 2021 US champion. So this was a fun video. We went through 4 games total, the 4 wins that So had en route to winning the US championship, and it goes to show that you don't necessarily have to be the player dominating in the normal stage of the tournament to win. Sometimes enough just to be undefeated, have a solid +2. If no one else does any better than that, you get to a playoff, and then you show you're a great skill in rapid and blitz chess and win both games like So did. And I mean, I guess it's also true, like going into the playoff, I did think that So would be a favourite because Caruana historically has not been quite as strong in his like sort of blitz to rapid sort of playoffs, and Sevian, of course, very good blitz player, rated 3000-ish on chess.com, but not quite in the same caliber or the same experience in his playoffs as So or Caruana. So that's the story of how Wesley So won the US Championship of 2021. Do let me know in the comments below, like, what were your thoughts on the tournament in general, if you were following the tournament, or if you want, like, what was your favourite move that Wesley So played in the games that we saw here. Do let me know in the comments below. Like I said, it really helps me with the algorithm if you like the video, and definitely consider subscribing as well for more of my Grandmaster Chess videos. Alright guys, see you in the next one. Get out of here.